In the vast, untamed stretch of land where loyalty meant survival and betrayal could burn through a family like wildfire, there lived a poor cowboy named Levi, known not for his wealth, but for the way he honored his word. He didn't have much, just a worn saddle, a tired horse, and a heart that believed too easily. When Levi finally married the woman he loved, Amara, a tribal healer with fire in her spirit, he thought his quiet, hard life had finally found something sacred. But what he didn't know was that the real danger wasn't the dust storms or the desert outlaws. It was blood. His own. They say it was trust that doomed him. That when the tribe summoned him to ride north for 3 nights, he left without hesitation, placing his cousin Silas in charge of his ranch, his fire, and his bride. Family's thicker than fire, Levi had once said with a grin, tapping Silas on the chest. But some fires burn from the inside out. And when Levi returned at dawn, what he found didn't just break his spirit. It shattered the very ground the tribe stood on. Amara wasn't in their bed. The horses were gone. And Silas? He left behind a single feather, one that belonged to Amara's ceremonial headdress. That feather, once a symbol of healing and devotion, now lay twisted in betrayal. Levi stood in silence, the morning wind howling around him like a ghost scream. But the worst part wasn't the loss. It was the how. Because that betrayal didn't just wound a man. It dishonored a sacred trust between tribes, between kin, between hearts that had once beat in rhythm with the land itself. The tribe gathered before noon. The elders whispered. The warriors stared. No one spoke Levi's name. Not because they blamed him, but because they feared what would come next. Some betrayals echo beyond blood. They split earth, memory, and legacy. And what Silas had done, in the dark of night, was more than theft. It was desecration. And Levi, he didn't raise his voice. He just tightened his saddle strap and whispered, "Then let the earth remember him." What happened next became legend, etched in a bone, sand, and fire. Because Levi didn't ride for revenge. He rode for something far deeper. And when the tribe saw what he uncovered, they knew the betrayal hadn't just torn through a marriage. It had awakened something the desert had buried long ago. Levi didn't speak to anyone after the gathering. He simply packed what little he had, his rifle, a water skin, a pouch of dried meat, and the red cloth Amara had once tied around his wrist before their wedding. Then he mounted his horse and rode south, against the wind, toward the canyons that swallowed men whole. No one knew where Silas had gone, but the tracks were fresh, and Levi knew his cousin's arrogance would be his undoing. Silas had always ridden hard, but never smart. And Levi was smart when it hurt most. The trail led through sacred ground, places no outsider dared to pass without offering tribute to the spirits that kept the desert alive. Levi didn't bring gifts. He brought grief. And grief, in those parts, was a kind of offering too. The wind didn't push against him. It moved with him. Even the vultures that circled above seemed to know they weren't watching prey. They were watching justice take form. By nightfall, he had reached the jagged cliffs of Wounded Ridge, where the sand turned black and echoes carried stories not meant for daylight. He camped under a dead tree, with bark scorched from lightning long ago. As the fire crackled low, Levi didn't sleep. He remembered Amara's laughter when she first tried on his too big hat. Silas raising a glass at their wedding, smiling too wide. He remembered how the old chief once warned him, "A man's greatest enemy wears his face and knows his heart." At the time, Levi thought it was just superstition. But now, under that wide, silent sky, it felt like prophecy. By dawn, hoof prints veered west, toward a watering hole guarded by an old Apache shrine. Levi followed, but slower now, not from fatigue, but from the weight of what he knew was coming. This wasn't just about a stolen bride. It was about a stolen truth. He began to recall things he'd overlooked. How Silas lingered too long near Amara when she danced. How his cousin always said, "Family sacred," with a crooked smile. Levi saw now, Silas hadn't taken Amara in passion. He planned this. When Levi arrived at the shrine, he found more than footprints. A piece of Amara's dress hung from a cactus thorn, bloodied at the corner. A trail of ash led to a broken fire pit, still warm. And beside it, pressed into the sand with eerie precision, was a single handprint, small, deliberate, and marked with 3 vertical lines. It wasn't Apache. It wasn't tribal. It was hers. And Levi understood the message clearly. She left it behind. Not in fear, but as a warning. Levi didn't know where Amara had learned to leave signs like that. But he knew one thing. She wasn't broken. She wasn't waiting to be saved. She was fighting. And that changed everything. His pace quickened. His pulse sharpened. This wasn't about reclaiming a stolen bride anymore. This was about reaching her before Silas silenced her story. Because Amara didn't just carry love in her hands. She carried memory, wisdom passed through generations of tribal mothers who healed with herbs and dreamed in firelight. The tracks turned uphill, toward a place the elders called Whispering Rock, a cliffside where the wind moved through hollow stones, singing like a woman in mourning. Levi had never climbed it, but as he ascended, every footfall felt heavier with purpose. The silence around him wasn't empty. It watched. Ravens gathered in crooked trees, their wings twitching at each step. Even the stones underfoot seemed to press back, like they were remembering old sins. At the summit, he found them. Silas sat by the edge, rifle across his knees, hat pulled low. Amara stood a few feet behind him, arms bound but eyes burning like wildfire. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. When she saw Levi, her lips parted, not in plea, but in warning. "Don't come closer," she said. "He wants you to." Silas chuckled, rising slowly. "Well, cousin," he sneered, "you were always too late for everything, except pain." Levi didn't draw his weapon. He dropped it. Silas raised his rifle instinctively, but something about Levi's posture made him hesitate. "You want to shoot me?" Levi said, voice low. "You'll lose her forever." Silence stretched. Wind howled between the rocks. Silas stepped back. "She chose me," he snapped. Amara didn't answer him. She looked only at Levi. And then, slowly, deliberately, she stomped her heel into the dirt 3 times. Another symbol. Another warning. Levi saw it and moved. In a blur, he lunged, not toward Silas, but toward the rock beneath him. A chunk of stone, loosened by years of erosion and one precise stomp, gave way. Silas stumbled as the ground shifted beneath him. The rifle fired, wild, useless. And in the next breath, he was on the edge, hanging by one arm, gasping, cursing. Levi stood over him, heart pounding. And this time, he didn't speak. He just watched, as Silas, full of rage and betrayal, finally faced the silence he had buried for years. Silas clung to the edge, fingernails bloodied, boots scraping for grip. The wind screamed around them, like a warning from the canyon itself. Below, the drop was merciless, sharp, jagged stone waiting with the patience of time. Levi stood above, his shadow long across his cousin's desperate face. "You don't have to do this," Silas growled, sweat and fear thick in his voice. But Levi didn't answer right away. He looked to Amara, whose wrists were still bound, her expression still unwavering. There was no plea in her eyes, only truth. And Levi, finally, understood. He knelt beside Silas and grabbed his wrist, not out of mercy, but out of memory. "Do you remember when we were boys?" Levi asked, his voice quiet, steady. "You broke your leg falling from the barn roof, and I carried you for 6 miles through the snow." Silas said nothing, jaw trembling. "Back then, you said I was the only person you trusted." Levi's grip tightened. "And I believed you. Until you proved trust is just a word to you, not a bond." With a burst of effort, Levi hauled him up and threw him to the ground. Not to save him, but to spare him. Silas collapsed, coughing, too stunned to speak. Levi didn't look at him again. Instead, he turned to Amara, quickly slicing her bindings with his knife. Her hands were raw, but her spine was unbent. "You knew he'd come here," Levi said. Amara nodded. "He always wanted the highest place. Thought it meant power." She paused. "But power isn't height. It's memory. And he forgot who we are." They descended the ridge together in silence, leaving Silas where he lay. He didn't follow, not because he was broken, but because the weight of his own betrayal had finally settled in. And the wind, once his ally, now passed over him without care. Amara and Levi didn't speak much that night by the fire. But as the stars blinked into the sky, Amara reached for Levi's hand and said, "You didn't come to rescue me. You came to see me." And that, more than any vengeance, was the healing she had waited for. In the village, they were met with silence, not of judgment, but of reverence. The people gathered slowly, eyes on the red cloth still tied around Levi's wrist. No one asked about Silas. They didn't need to. They saw it in Levi's gait, in Amara's stare. The storm had passed, but its lesson had roots now. A betrayal had been answered, not with fire, but with remembrance. And the tribe, forever changed, bowed their heads, not to Levi, not to Amara, but to the old truth they had almost forgotten, that when you betray blood tied by spirit, the land never stays still. Days later, Levi sat with the elders, the fire between them crackling with stories older than speech. The eldest among them, eyes clouded with years but sharp with wisdom, leaned forward. "You did not act like most men," he said. "You didn't come back looking for war. You came looking for truth." Levi nodded, his gaze distant. "He betrayed me, yes. But what broke me wasn't losing her. It was losing what we meant." He paused. What family meant. The elders understood. For them, betrayal wasn't just an act. It was a fracture in the foundation that held the tribe together. When trust is broken between kin, the ripple can stretch across generations. And yet, here sat a man who had not let rage poison the soil. Levi had chosen not to let Silas's fire consume the sacred. And that choice, quiet, deliberate, was more powerful than any bullet ever fired in the West. Amara, meanwhile, returned to her healing. But she was changed. The women came to her not just for medicine, but for guidance. They asked not how to escape pain, but how to transform it. And Amara, without ceremony, would say, by being seen, fully, not as broken, not as victim, but as fire that chose to rise instead of burn. Her words carried through the valley like seeds in the wind, planting strength in every heart that heard them. Levi and Amara never spoke again of what happened on Whispering Rock. They didn't need to. The land had taken the story and woven it into stone and shadow. And sometimes, when the wind came from the south, the children claimed they could hear a man shouting on the ridge, his voice echoing into emptiness. They'd ask who it was, and the elders would only say, "A man who forgot the weight of trust." But others remembered. And as Levi walked the edge of the village each morning, tending to the horses or fixing a broken fence, the people would nod in passing, not in pity, but in quiet respect. Because in the Old West, legends weren't made from gold or gunfire. They were made in silence, in the choices no one saw, and in the way a man carried betrayal without letting it carry him. The seasons changed, but the memory of what had happened that summer on Whispering Rock did not fade. The land remembered. The people remembered. Even the animals walked with more caution near the cliffs where truth had once cracked the stone. Levi worked quietly, rebuilding his fence, mending leather, helping with the herd. But those who watched him saw something else, a stillness deeper than silence. A man who had seen what betrayal looked like up close and had chosen not to let it rot his soul. Amara's presence became more rooted, more unshakable. She began teaching the young women the old songs again, the ones sung by moonlight, passed down from women who held the line between spirit and flesh. Her voice, calm and clear, carried through the fields, and even the wind seemed to still when she spoke. And slowly, the tribe began to change, not through rules or laws, but through example. The way Levi looked a man in the eye, the way Amara listened without flinching, the way neither of them pretended healing was quick or easy. Silas was not seen again, but his shadow lingered. Sometimes, travelers came through the valley and mentioned a man with hollow eyes who drank alone by the southern border towns. They said he looked like he was always listening for something, like he expected the ground to open and swallow him whole. No one pursued him. No one needed to. He had been judged not by men, but by the very earth that once trusted his footsteps. One evening, Levi stood at the edge of the village with the old chief, watching the sky turn copper as the sun dipped below the canyon. "Do you regret sparing him?" the chief asked softly. Levi didn't answer immediately. He thought of Silas's face hanging off that cliff, not begging, but daring. And he thought of Amara's heels stamping once, twice, 3 times. "No," Levi said finally. "I didn't spare him. I spare me." The chief nodded. then you're twice the man most men ever hope to be. That night, the tribe gathered for a rare fire circle, not to celebrate, but to remember. The youngest children sat cross-legged around the flames, and the elders told stories, not of vengeance, not of victory, but of balance, of choosing the harder path. And when the fire cracked loud in the silence, one girl whispered to her sister, "That was the sound the earth made when he came home." No one corrected her, because maybe she was right. In time, a new generation rose, boys and girls who had not seen the betrayal firsthand, but carried its lesson in their bones. They grew up learning that love was not possession, that family was not entitlement, and that silence could be the strongest kind of justice. Levi became a mentor without trying to be one. His words were few, but his presence taught more than sermons ever could. When a young man once asked him how to tell if someone could be trusted, Levi replied, "Watch what they do when your back is turned, and when your heart is open." Amara's influence spread beyond the tribe. Travelers began to come seeking her counsel. Men and women wounded not by bullets, but by betrayal, by loss, by silence too heavy to carry alone. She never gave advice quickly. She listened. She asked questions. And when she finally spoke, it was like the wind through canyon walls, measured, ancient, necessary. Her pain had become medicine, and it flowed from her not in bitterness, but in clarity. They never remarried. Not out of sorrow, but out of truth. Their bond was not one that needed to be wrapped in ceremony again. It had already been tested in fire, silence, and stone. They lived together, worked side by side, and when they walked through the village, people gave space, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Because these were not just two people who survived betrayal. They were two people who transformed it. And so, life in the tribe grew richer. Not in coin, but in wisdom. Old feuds softened. Land disputes were resolved without fire. And whenever a disagreement grew hot, someone would eventually murmur, "Remember Levi." That was enough. Because remembering him meant remembering the time a man faced the deepest cut a heart can suffer, and still chose not to swing the blade in return. And somewhere out there, far beyond the cliffs, Silas remained. No one spoke his name anymore, not from spite, but from understanding. His story had ended the moment Levi refused to let it become his own. In the Old West, not every ghost was banished with bullets. Some are laid to rest by a choice, quiet, deliberate, final. And that, more than any duel or draw, is what carved Levi's name into the legend of the land. Years passed like shadows over the mesa, silent, steady, undeniable. Levi grew older, his hair grayer, his steps slower, but his presence only deepened. He was no longer just a man who had returned from betrayal. He had become the one who carried the wound without letting it poison the well. Children followed him not out of duty, but because they sensed that wherever he walked, the ground felt safer. And in a world where pain often turned to vengeance, that kind of safety was sacred. Amara aged like stone, weathered, beautiful, unshakable. Her wisdom became legend, but she never claimed that title. "I am not a legend," she once told a young girl who tried to bow before her. "I am just someone who refused to disappear." She still walked the land barefoot in spring, still sang to the stars in the old tongue, still watched the edge of the village every dusk, as if guarding it from a memory she had forgiven, but never forgotten. One afternoon, a traveler arrived, dusty, worn, wide-eyed. He had heard of the couple who defied betrayal with stillness and walked away stronger. "I lost everything," he told Levi by the well. "They took my wife. My brother helped them." Levi listened without judgment, just as the chief had once listened to him. When the man finished, Levi said only this, "Then don't let them take you too." The traveler stared, and something inside him shifted. That night, Levi sat by the fire with Amara, their hands near but not touching, the silence warm between them. "You ever think about what would have happened if I'd let him fall?" he asked, his voice like gravel worn smooth by time. Amara didn't answer immediately. She stared into the flames, then said, "Then you would have carried him in your shadow, instead of letting him fall out of your heart." Levi nodded. Nothing more needed to be said, and the fire crackled on, as the stars bloomed above the canyon once again, casting their light down on the old stones, on the young children listening from afar, and on the land that had once trembled beneath betrayal, but now pulsed quietly with peace, because a man had chosen not to fight like the world expected, but to forgive like the earth remembered. The day Levi passed, the sky was clear, the wind calm, and the land quiet. No signs of violence. No long goodbyes. Just the man, seated on the ridge, his hat tilted low, his boots crossed, and his eyes fixed on the horizon he had once ridden toward with fire in his chest. Amara found him there, still and peaceful, his hand resting on the red cloth she had tied around his wrist so many years ago. Not clenched, open. The village didn't weep loudly. They lit fires and sang the old songs. The children carried stones and placed them in a circle near the ridge, where Levi had so often stood guard, not over the people, but over their memory. And on one stone, carved with care, were the words passed down like a sacred truth. He remembered the wound, and chose not to bleed it into others. Amara stood before the tribe that night, her back tall, her voice steady. He didn't just survive betrayal, she said. He taught the land how to carry it. Her words echoed across the canyon, through the branches, across the skin of the wind. And in that silence afterward, every soul present felt the ground beneath them breathe. They never built a statue. They didn't need to. Levi became part of the land, his story woven into the dust, into the stone, into the way people paused before speaking out of anger. And in time, the tale spread far beyond the tribe. It wasn't a story of revenge. It wasn't a tale of justice. It was a lesson, a truth so rare it felt like myth, until you saw the fire in Amara's eyes and the steadiness in her voice, and knew it had all been real. And so, the man who once trusted too easily, and was broken before dawn, became the one whose silence healed an entire people. Not because he was perfect, but because he was honest, because he chose, and because, in the Old West, where guns ruled and grudges festered, one poor cowboy proved that the greatest strength of all is knowing when to let go. As years turned to decades, Levi's name was no longer spoken in anger or even sorrow, but in reverence. His story became a rite of passage for the youth of the tribe. Before a boy could be called a man, before a girl could speak to the ancestors of the fire, they would walk the ridge where Levi once stood. There, they would sit in silence, listen to the wind, and place their palm on the earth, not to ask for answers, but to remember the question, what will I carry and what will I release? Amara remained a guiding force, not as a widow, but as a keeper of the sacred. She never wore black, never cloaked herself in mourning. Instead, she dressed in colors, in cloth dyed with the same plants she once used to heal wounds. He is not gone, she would say. He is just everywhere now. And when the children asked if she still missed him, she'd smile and reply, I don't miss what I still feel in my bones. One evening, under a red sky, she was visited by a stranger, a young woman with Levi's eyes and the quiet calm of his presence. My mother told me about him, the girl said. She said he saved her once, just by listening. Amara took the girl's hand and walked with her along the edge of the canyon. He saved us all, she whispered, not by what he did, but by what he didn't. And with those words, she passed her story into new hands. That girl would grow to become the next healer of the tribe, and she too would sing the songs beneath the moonlight, and she too would sit with strangers and listen until their pain unraveled itself into understanding. And when people asked her where her strength came from, she would answer, from a man who let his heart break, but didn't let it make him cruel. And so Levi's story continued, not in books, but in lives, not in monuments, but in moments of choice. Every time someone forgave when they could have fought, every time someone listened when it hurt, every time someone chose to carry pain without passing it on, the ground hummed beneath them, and the ridge remembered. There's a place, far from any trail, where the wind always sings low, and the earth seems warmer than it should be. A circle of stones rests there, not grand, not marked, just known. Travelers stumble upon it sometimes. They don't always understand why they feel compelled to kneel, or place a hand on the ground, or whisper something they've never said aloud. But they do, and when they rise, they carry something lighter. This is the legacy of Levi, not vengeance, not legend, but release. He taught that the hardest thing a man can do is let go of what he has every right to hold. That real justice is not about taking back what was stolen, but choosing not to become what stole it. His betrayal could have poisoned the land. Instead, it fertilized it. It made way for something stronger than pride, peace born from memory. The Old West was full of men who drew their guns fast. But Levi's hands, once open in sorrow, became the symbol of a different kind of power. One that couldn't be drawn, one that couldn't be stolen, one that whispered instead of shouted, and yet echoed across generations. And as the sun rises over that ridge each morning, casting gold over the stones, the land itself seems to say, "This is where a man stood and chose to walk away whole." Amara's time came gently, like a sigh. She asked to be buried beside him, under the tree that grew from roots watered by silence. And when the final stone was placed over her heart, the people didn't weep. They sat in stillness. And in that stillness, they felt both of them, together again, not in body but in balance. A love not lost, but fulfilled. And if you ever find yourself near that ridge, and the wind feels heavier than usual, stop. Close your eyes. Lay your palm to the earth. And listen. Not for noise, but for truth. Because somewhere beneath the dust and the bones of that old betrayal, the earth still holds Levi's choice, and it's waiting to remind you that your choice matters too. In a land where betrayal often led to bloodshed and justice was measured by how fast a man could draw, Levi carved a different path, one far more difficult and infinitely more powerful. He was betrayed not by an enemy, but by his own kin, and yet he did not return that betrayal in kind. Instead, he carried the weight of that pain without letting it twist him. And through that choice, he gave the tribe something few men ever leave behind, a way forward that doesn't begin with revenge. Levi taught that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't to fight, but to see another's brokenness without letting it break you, to see your own wound without letting it define who you become. In a place where people lived by scars and died by pride, he stood as a quiet rebellion against both. His story reminds us that healing doesn't always roar, it often whispers. And that whisper, when honored, can echo louder than any gunshot. Amara's strength, too, left a mark no time could erase. She didn't wait to be rescued. She left signs, she endured, and she rose. Her dignity, her wisdom, her fire, those things were not taken from her by betrayal. They were sharpened by it. Together, she and Levi didn't just survive, they transformed the meaning of what it means to be broken. They proved that even the most painful stories can become sacred when carried with truth and tenderness. So if this story reached you, if it stirred something in your chest, reminded you of a silence you carry or a choice you've yet to make, remember this. We are all given a moment when we must choose what to do with our wounds. Will we bleed them into others, or will we build something with them? That decision, quiet and unseen, is what defines the legacy we leave in this world. If this story moved you, take a moment to stay close. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the stories that help us remember who we are. Leave a comment below, share what this tale awakened in you. And if you feel it, like this video so others may find it. Because sometimes, all it takes to heal is to listen to the earth where another once chose peace instead of fury. And let that choice live on.